Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Fremantle Network Politics of the Park. Alright, so our MC tonight has been a regular for Politics of the Park for years now. She's been a teacher for decades and an activist and engaged the community for even longer than that. I don't know what else to say other than she has a beautiful garden, a wonderful dog, and she's a great inspiration for a lot of people in our community. Please welcome Fran McCarthy.
So I would like to open this forum by acknowledging that this land that we meet on is Whadjuk country. The Whadjuk Noongar people are the traditional owners, and they have a rich and historical environmental connection to this land. I'd also like to add my personal thanks to the people who have come, who obviously care, who obviously have taken Halloween out of their agenda to come to something that is really important. So thank you for coming and welcome. So the topic tonight is the 2023 UN Climate Change Conference, which is better known as COP28, and that starts on the 30th of November in Dubai. On your tables there's an explanation sheet about these annual UN climate conferences. It has been prepared by the members of the Greens Climate Crisis Working Group. The values of these annual international climate conferences is contested. Many believe that these are absolutely essential and our best hope for dealing with the climate crisis. And some nations have made impressive climate privileges, especially since the 2015 Paris COP. However, climate champions such as Greta Thunberg regard them as just more blah blah waste of time. So, what has been the successes and the failures of these global conferences, and what can we expect from the Dubai Climate Conference of Change? You are here because you care. We have 4 speakers who care a lot. So the format for tonight is that you will hear from 4 special guest speakers, and they will give a 5 to 6 minute presentation. Then we'll take a 10-minute break and return for an hour of audience questions and opinions. You should find a paper and pen on your table, and then use that to record any questions that you think of that you can then ask our guest speakers in the Q&A session. So it is with great pleasure that I invite Bill Hare to come up as our first speaker. I will let everyone know that Christian has a timer, and the timer is a clap at 5 minutes, 2 claps at 6 minutes, and then invite everyone to clap to wrap it up. Bill Hare is a physician. Oh, sorry, he's not. He's a physicist who has been involved in the climate issue since the 80s. He founded Climate Analytics, a global climate science policy institute headquartered in Berlin. He has attended every one of the 27 UN climate change conferences and was a lead author in the 4th assessment report, which was written by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is IPCC, which I'll talk about later, for which the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2007. I would call this man a climate change expert, and the spiel that he gave was an underestimation of his knowledge, talent and experience. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm here as the leading act for Sophie, who's coming after me. And I just heard that if I go on for long enough, there's going to be huge applause. Look, I've been involved with the climate game somehow ever since it began. I've been involved as a scientist, as an activist. I worked at Greenpeace in the 90s, and I did all of the COPs. And in fact, I was involved with the process that designed the COPs. We'll come back to the COPs in a few minutes. So I just want to talk about where we are now on the front, because I think everyone's aware that this year we've seen absolutely enormous changes to the climate system. seen massive heat waves, extraordinary floods. We've seen loss of Arctic sea ice, extraordinary levels, Antarctic sea ice at record low levels, and all sorts of other changes like that going on that have issued a very clear warning sign. Now, the scientific community has been, I guess, campaigning, you can say, for years to get action on this issue. The IPCC reports have been fundamental in bringing about the action that has actually happened, but far from enough has actually occurred. So we find ourselves now on the brink of a really big climate catastrophe unless we can really get action moving. Right now, we look at the world's commitments, the commitments made by countries and their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs as they're termed under the Paris Agreement. We're headed towards something like 2.4 to 2.7 degrees of warming, maybe more. So we're a long way from the 1.5 degree limit in the Paris Agreement. The one thing I want to get across here tonight is just how important that 1.5 degree limit is. Many years ago, we all thought in the science community perhaps 2 degrees would be a safe level. And I was very much involved with the European Union's efforts to look at this in the mid-90s, and we sort of conversed on a warming level of 2 degrees, but the science progressed along the way, and we began to realise that actually 2 degrees was very dangerous. By the time we got to the late 2000s, 2008, I was asked to present the most recent IPCC assessment to the small island states and least developed countries, and we did so. And they came back from a closed meeting and said, no, 2 degrees doesn't work. So that's where the 1.5 degree limit came from. It came from the most vulnerable countries who looked at the science and said, no, 1.5 degrees is not safe, but it's a whole lot safer than 2 degrees. Now, this is very important because sitting in Western Australia, we're very obsessed with gas, right? Aren't we? And there's a huge difference between the emission pathways you need to be on between 1.5 and 2 degrees. If you look at aiming your warming limit at 1.8 or 2 degrees, you should not be worried about what Woodside is doing or any of the other gas companies because there's more than enough carbon space, right? If you're worried about limiting warming to something like 1.5 degrees and lower in the long term, then there's very little carbon space left. And we know that. A paper came out yesterday, or today actually, which shows that the budget is even smaller than we thought. So now we find ourselves in a situation this year where there's a lot of questioning going on about the 1.5 degree limit. I know that in this state there's a lot of people, even on this side of politics, who say it's lost, it's busted. Well, I'm here to say it's basically not true. It's only lost or busted if we don't get off our butts and get governments to take enough action. The world's best scientists have worked for decades in some cases to show how this can be done. And we know that technologically and economically it can be done at great benefit. But we also know that we have arraigned against us the most powerful industry this planet has ever seen, the fossil fuel industry. And the only industry, the only groups that really benefit from arguments that 1.5 degrees is not possible or not plausible is them and no one else. Because right now, whether or not the world could limit warming to 1.5 degrees is hanging in the balance. You've heard this from that extraordinarily left-wing radical, the director of the International Energy Agency in the last weeks, saying this is our last chance, and saying it can be done and it's going to produce massive economic benefits all over the planet. So people need to get out of their heads that 1.5 degrees is lost, because it's only lost if we don't pay enough attention and we don't put enough pressure on our political class. And for those of you that make the ultimate sacrifice every morning and read the West Australian, you can see the news there from our dear Premier Cook, who has now said Western Australia needs to take it one for the planet and expand our gas so Japan can get to zero. Well, that is just the biggest pile of bullshit I ever heard. It just doesn't work. Now, that's the challenge that we've got, and that frames in a way what is going on ahead of the COP and at the COP. As we sit here today, the pre-COP is meeting in Dubai, and is now preparing all of the decisions that will be made at the COP itself. But what are the COPs? When we negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COPs were set up as the ultimate decision-making body of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. What's special about the COPs is not that they decide individual countries' emission limits, no. What you see coming out of the COPs on ambition is the mirror that you look in every day. It's your country. What your country doesn't do is what the COP doesn't do, right? So it's what your country does and takes to the COPs that makes all the difference. Australia just happens to have an appalling record over my entire professional career in this space, so think about it. So what we're looking at for the COP ahead in the Emirates is something really serious. The gas industry has been making an incredible push to knock off implementation of the Paris Agreement. And it's having some success, and a lot of success in Western Australia. Now the COPs are under some criticism and was noted here, but one thing you really need to know about the COPs, the most fundamental political thing is that the COPs put every country at the same level. That means that Kiribati or Tuvalu, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, the Marshalls, Samoa are on an eye level with the Chinese minister, with the US minister, with the European minister, with the Indian minister. That is, they are in the same room around the same tables, right? And that is the only place and the only time in the international space where they have that right and that role. Now what that leads to is a situation where every now and again something really important happens at COPs. So, COP1, we decided that there would be a Kyoto Protocol. It was agreed, it was negotiated, done a few years later at COP3. George Bush killed it off, right? There were attempts also in 2009 to set up a new treaty. That failed, I think under pressure from the fossil fuel industry. But in the end, we came back again and again to the COP in Paris, and we got the Paris Agreement. Now, nearly 30 years ago, in a hotel room in Geneva, some of us drafted an idea for loss and damage mechanism, the idea of actually compensating, I can't use that word in negotiations, but compensating countries for the damages that they experience from climate change. 30 years later, we got that done at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. This COP has to basically take that and implement that agreement. Now the COP this year is about actually the major and most fundamental thing it's got to do is actually take the next step towards major emission commitments for countries. It's called the Global Stocktake. The Paris Agreement had three main architectural elements. One, Article 2.1, the 1.5 degree limit. Article 4.1, the net zero, if you like, getting to net zero by 2050. And number three, a 5-year ratchet up cycle where leaders were being required to come into public every 5 years and say whether or not they were stepping up. The COP this year sets up the framing for that. It's called the Global Stocktake. That is the most critical thing that has to happen at this COP. If it doesn't move forward in a formal way, then the Paris Agreement begins to die, right? So that is the main challenge of the COP. Now the big public demands around the COP are going to be about getting a fossil fuel phase out. It's fairly obvious that the COP president is not going to read that. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to keep calling for it, because we are gradually and surely beginning to make progress. We're beginning to hear that term used. I was invited to the Secretary General's Ambition Summit at the UN headquarters in September, and I heard around the room 90 countries, 92 actually, calling for a fossil fuel phase out. I've never heard that. I'm going to keep going until I get applause. And I've never heard that in my entire career. Usually it's 3 or 4, or Greenpeace. Started out as Greenpeace years and years ago, frankly. We had our fossil-free energy scenario back in the mid-90s that I presented to Fatty Burrow when he was a junior researcher there. And now he's talking about it himself. That's great. But that's what the COP is really about this year, is getting that moving. The inside politics of the Global Stocktake, set the agenda for the 2025 commitments. And number 2, to keep alive the fossil fuel phase out debate and movement.
I anticipate that you are in for a treat. I listened to Sophie at an Oxfam dinner not that long ago, and one impressive speaker who has done so much in a very short time. And she's here, as you have heard, on very short notice. Sophie McNeill has worked for ABC's foreign correspondent, SBS's Dateline, and is a former host of the news and current affairs program Hack On with Triple J. She was Australian Young TV Journalist of the Year twice, and was nominated for Walkie Awards for her investigative work in Afghanistan and her coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis. She took herself off when she was really young, just with a camera, to become a journalist. In 2020, Sophie left the ABC to work as a researcher for Human Rights Watch, and has recently taken on the role of senior campaigner with Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Sophie believes climate change is the biggest human rights crisis facing us today. Her motto is, if we don't get it right, then nothing else matters. Give it up for Sophie.
Thank you so much. And yes, a late understudy stepped up just early this afternoon, so apologies if I'm not prepared, but I'd just like to also acknowledge I'm standing on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Because Indigenous justice is so interlinked with climate justice, particularly in this country. Just a little bit about why I now work in climate. I have spent my career covering human rights crises. It's been particularly painful for me the past few weeks looking at what's been happening in Gaza, a place that I've worked on and off since 2007. I've got dear friends trapped right now in Gaza who I message every day to see if they're still alive. That's the point we're at. But I stepped away from that work because I truly believe that this is the big one. I spent years working in the Middle East where I met all of these parents who had such a desperate look in their eyes because they could never tell their kids that they would be safe. They could never guarantee that safety. Something we can see happening right now in Gaza, which I've seen in the eyes of many parents I've met in Gaza over the years. But it was never something that I could directly relate to. I've got kids, but I've always been able to tell them that they were safe. They used to live in a nice little house in Jerusalem while I went off to Gaza, while I went off to Yemen, while I went off to Mosul. And I could always reassure them that they'd be safe. And it wasn't until I moved back to Australia and I took my kids to the first school strike that we'd been in the country for in 2019 in Sydney. And my 7-year-old, Quinn, was listening to all the speeches at the school strike. And he just looked up at me and he said, "We're going to be able to fix this, won't we, Mum?" And of course I lied through my teeth and said, "Yeah, we've got this, it's going to be fine." And for the first time I could really feel like all those parents I'd met over the years who couldn't honestly look their kids in the eye and tell them that they would be safe, that everything would be okay. And it was pretty much from that point onwards that I decided, right, if I really care about human rights, then I need to work full-time on climate. So that's why I'm here today. And I'm not part of Greenpeace's COP working group like Jess Panagiris, who she's too ill to be here. But I did want to give you a bit of an insight first into what Greenpeace is hoping to get out of this COP, and then tell you more about our local campaign that we're running here, because it does directly relate to the fossil fuel phase out. But first, basically, there's two pathways that this COP can take as Greenpeace sees it. We're either going to finally agree on a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, or this climate summit, which is run by an oil and gas CEO, could turn into the biggest greenwashing event ever. And I'll tell you now that Greenpeace is going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that it's not the latter, because we cannot allow more lies and more greenwashing. This COP has to be a moment of truth. We need leaders to acknowledge that to meet the 1.5 limit as agreed to in Paris, they have to urgently agree to a fossil fuel phase out and to stop the expansion of coal, oil and gas. Our key demands are to stop all new fossil fuel developments and to make polluters pay. That is a key demand for us at this COP. We want progress towards a financial mechanism that makes the fossil fuel industry pay for loss and damage and to meet the needs of those least responsible. What we're also hoping to achieve at this COP is to a tripling of renewable energy by 2030, a doubling of energy efficiency from 2022 levels by 2030, and a 75% reduction in methane emissions, which is a really important one for Western Australia with our massive gas production that we have here. And as Bill said, 1.5 is still alive. That's very firmly Greenpeace's line. We will fight for that tooth and nail as well. And it's important to keep in mind that the window for 1.5 is currently being kept open thanks to accelerating progress on renewable energy. And it's the ongoing fossil fuel investment and expansion that are going to see that window closed if we don't all rise up and fight and make sure it happens. In terms of things to watch out for at this COP, watch out for hyperground CCS. We're deeply concerned that that's going to be big on the agenda of the fossil fuel interests in countries like Australia, trying to advance their fossil fuel interests. We're really closely looking for the term carbon management. Another phase that you might hear if you're following COP this closely. Just a load of greenwashing. As Bill referred to, making the Loss and Damage Fund a reality, making sure there's some real funds there, making sure Australia actually does pay its way. And we also want you to all be very wary of nature-based solutions. That's another kind of greenwashing trick that they might try and pull on us at this COP. But we want you to really think about what this means for us here in Western Australia. So we contribute 13% of the world's LNG. And gas is really a big frontline for us right now in the climate justice movement, because yes, there's still coal expansion happening, but it's much harder to get finance to open a new coal mine these days. But the LNG industry globally has really sold everybody a lie, positioning themselves as a transition fuel. And we here in Western Australia have a massive responsibility to stop that from happening. Some of the world's other big, largest exporters of LNG gas, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, places where there's no civil society, where you can't have an event like this, where you can't criticise the government and call on them to stop new fossil fuel projects. So really us here in West Australia are at a front line to try and take away the social licence of companies like Woodside, who are opening projects like the Burra Pond, because we have a global responsibility as West Australians. Right now, we've got our Premier, as Bill alluded to, saying that West Australia will bear the brunt and won't worry about its emissions because it will do its job of supplying Asia with gas. That's what we just saw, top line story in the West Australian today. But what we're doing is we're keeping our neighbours in Asia, who are already suffering the brunt of the climate crisis, addicted to fossil fuels. So Greenpeace has a global priority campaign here in West Australia. We're employing a new team, of which I've joined, to stop the Burra Pub from going ahead. The Browse project, we've just seen comments today from Premier Cook that is going to be decided in early 2024. So that is currently on Minister Pliberset's desk. We need all of you to contact Minister Pliberset to tell her that we can't have the Browse field be approved, because that is our real fear that that's going to happen in the first quarter of next year if we don't send a very strong message that the West Australian community, it's like a bad movie, Browse coming back again more than a decade later, they want to try and get this one through Woodside. So please sign up, join the Stop Burra Pub campaign, and answer your questions later. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Peter Newman. Peter Newman has been a resident of Fremantle for 50 years, and he was awarded the Order of Australia for distinguished service to science education as an academic and a researcher, in particular for his work on sustainable urban design and transport. Peter is Professor of Sustainability at Curtin Uni and has been an IPCC author for the last 12 years. Put your hands together for Peter.
Hi. I should say something about the being on the Wajak land. The thing to remember there is that they had been here 60,000 years, which covered an ice age. We went down to minus 2 or 3 degrees below. And they survived by moving around and setting up refuge here. And now they've got to help us over the next 60 years to get through this transition, because this is, we're going way beyond the space that's safe to have any kind of settlements. So I went to COP27 this time last year at Sharm el-Sheikh. Bill was there with his crew, and you know, he speaks daily to the Secretary General, this guy. This is not a small game that he's playing in. It was a fantastic event, because there were 60,000 of my best friends there, and all having fun in the streets and dancing and singing, and inside all kinds of displays of the latest climate change innovations happening. And in the business end, where all the nations were meeting, there was the global stocktake happening that Josh Byrne and I had been asked to go and help on, and we started talking about, because most politicians need to hear something hopeful, and we started talking about some of the good things we're doing in this state, like trackless trams. And the most amazing thing was to see how people came up from these countries and from organisations like BlackRock, the biggest finance company in the world, saying, tell us more about this, we want to know about things we can do. And so that was one of the reasons the Chinese have actually given us the trackless tram that's now sitting at the City of Stirling, and we're going to put that on display in November. So to try and show what can be done if you run a transport system off the sun. And so some things come out of these meetings, and they're certainly worth having. Bill's also did a report that came out, launched by, it was the very last thing done, completely missed by most of the press, but the report was called Integrity Matters. It was about what should be happening to ensure that the net zero thing really means something, and the certification processes are in place, and that all the cities and non-state actors need to get on with this job and do it properly. And Integrity Matters was adopted by all nations present. So you can use this document, beautifully written by Bill Hare in his house in White Gum Valley, whilst managing 120 people in Berlin. It's an amazing life he lived. So COP28 now is in Dubai, and it certainly is going to be the oil and gas COP. There's no doubt that the focus will be on that, because it's slipping through. There's a what I'm calling the Trumpian narrative that needs to be brought down to earth. I've written about this for what's the Greens magazine called? Rob, what's it called? Green Issue. Green Issue, there you go, it's coming out. They're bringing down the Trumpian narrative. So the Trumpian narrative is clean natural gas, or the net zero transition needs natural gas, or gas-led recovery, all of those sort of statements that are just not true. And the reality is that places like Dubai have a bit in both worlds, like we do. We have gas, and we are going to make as much as we can out of this while the Trumpian narrative wins and people are still think that they need it. But Dubai has been building a lot of renewable energy, and they're going to show that off, 2 gigawatts of it, and they've built a sustainable city in a particular area that's as good as anything I've seen in terms of running entirely off the sun, water-sensitive design, everyone bikes, and it works. So they show it off. Now, in many ways, this is what we do, because we can talk about the good things we're doing in Western Australia. We've got huge amounts of solar on our rooftops, and we're buying up batteries and electric vehicles, doing all the right things. But at the same time, we've got this monster of the gas expansion that's going to take the entire carbon budget of Australia, because they want to expand it for the next, well, until 2070. So this can't happen. It must be exposed. And one of the ways to do it is that they say they are a net zero option because they will do carbon capture and storage. And carbon capture and storage. Now we had an event last week where the Academy of Science and the Academy of Technology people as well came and had an event at Curtin which was called Climate Technologies for the Future. And the speakers, there was no one there from IPCC background, so I went along, but they didn't want me. Apparently I don't know anything. And the Chevron and Woodside were speakers, and they went through what they're doing about carbon capture and storage, because the Gorgon project is the biggest in the world, and that's going to demonstrate to the world how to do it. Unfortunately, it's not working. And they've only had since 2003 to get it to work. I was in Jeff Gallup's office when it was agreed to subdivide Barrow Island and put in this enormous facility, because the best marine sediments were there and you could put the carbon from the high CO2 gas and put it away there. And it's just struggling, and it's the biggest one in the world. So around the world they're setting up gas hubs where there'll be LNG produced and used, and as it's used they will put it back into these carbon capture and storage facilities. And it really is nonsense. The thermodynamics of it is not going to work. It's going to fail. It's going to be dismally expensive for anything to do. So we just have to see that this future isn't a possible one. They have to get off it. Now, so what do you say to these companies? Woodside, Chevron, Shell, they have to become renewable energy companies. They cannot do anything else. They will collapse if they are going to depend on gas sales. Because gas is going. There's a company called Ørsted. It's a Danish company. It was the biggest oil and gas company in Europe, it seems, and they have completely phased that out, and they are now just a renewable energy company, and it has worked. They have done extremely well as a company. They have survived, and other places like Aberdeen is moving from being the oil and gas capital of the UK to being the wind capital of the UK. We can make these changes, and we have to show Woodside that we can do that, and COP28 is one of the ways to do that.
So Tim Clifford will be our last speaker for this evening. He was a Greens Legislative Council MP for the East Metro region from 2017 to 2021. And during that time, he was the first member of the WA Parliament to introduce a Climate Change Act to address the climate crisis. Now he is the State Campaign Manager at Wilderness Society, very good cause, WA, focusing on protection of the North Jarrah forests and also stopping the expansion of the gas industry in the Kimberley. So put your hands together for Tim.
Thanks everyone. It's amazing that we have so many people here tonight, but I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wajak Noongar people, and just to acknowledge that, just to and also to acknowledge that it's been a pretty tough time for our First Nations communities going through the referendum. It's amazing to be here to be sharing this little bit of a stage with the likes of Newman, Bill Hare, and Sophie McNeill. Through my time, I've sat back and watched the amount of work that they've done and dedication. And my role as an MP back in the day was about fighting for the outcomes, and behind those outcomes was a lot of the data that I used coming from the likes of Bill Hare and Peter, and also the motivation to pursue the truth as much as Sophie McNeill had done through her career as a journalist, because we're all here and we all believe in the truth, but unfortunately many of our MPs don't. But I'd like to cast my mind back to, Peter Newman mentioned Barrow Island, the Gorgon project. A lot of people don't know that in my previous life, I spent 10 years as a labourer, as someone who worked in the construction industry. And I found myself on Barrow Island at one point. My boss sent me there. I think I was around 25 or 26 years old. And I was out there, and I flew in one day, and I could see all the dredging that was happening over the ocean. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me in regards to the environment, because social justice was a bit of my thing because of the way that we're treated as workers and workplace agreements and so forth. But what really struck me is that a lot of the information that was being fed out to the public and what was actually happening on Barrow Island was two different things. There was a lot of greenwashing going on. And I took the time to go speak to one of the environmental officers, and I said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Well, everyone are working here, but there are a lot of things that are going on here that I can't actually talk about." And in fact, with the amount of things that are going on here, I'm sort of dreading for the future. And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, they're only here because they want to put on their resume to go to places like Antarctica and other remote places across the globe and start drilling to extract gas and export it." But I fundamentally, she said to me, "I fundamentally don't agree with this because it's pushing the climate crisis, or will compound the climate issue." And at that time, I didn't know anything about climate change. It was just, I didn't know anything about science. I didn't really know anything about politics, which is probably a good thing. So I don't know how I'm MP. But fast forward 9 years later, and I was sitting in the MP's lounge at the Parliament, and it was late 2019. The fires had just started, or not long after, and we could literally see Australia burning. And I looked around the room, and it was quite surreal because I could see it was every party in the room. It was during the lunch break, the dinner break, and Brad Pettit, who's here tonight, knows it very well, how everyone, they get together and they all sort of, they're not always at each other's necks, but they always sit down to find time for a drink at dinner time. But I could see what was happening on the television, and I was thinking to myself, God, what are we doing? What are we doing when our own leaders in our state, our political leaders, can see this unfolding on the television and not do anything about what's actually unfolding in front of our eyes, which is an escalation is something that's very preventable. And I do share the hope of the hope that Bill alluded to, that I do think we can keep it to 1.5, and I do think we can do it, but it's going to take a lot of work. But I made the point of really reaching out to these people to find out, what makes you tick? What's the thing that actually keeps you going? Because a lot of these people have children, like many people in this room. And I'd been in 2019, coming to the end of 2019, we had a huge resurgence in the climate movement. We had people taking on government, calling them out for the things they weren't doing, and also for the things they were doing, looking to expand the gas industry, looking to support what Woodside's doing, which was terrible. And I'd asked a lot of questions that year. Because we were building up to introduce the climate bill that was mentioned before. I asked a lot of questions about the carbon capture and storage on Barrow Island. Unfortunately, it still hadn't worked, and yet the government was still pouring taxpayer dollars into trying to support it to get it off the ground. And there was no accountability for these industries. And that's why in 2020 I introduced the Climate Change Act, and I won't go into all the details, but you can find online. But what I did find is COVID represented something that was a real free kick for not only the federal government, as Scott Morris has been skewed, but also the state government. Mark McGowan, we drove in tonight on the bus and I could see a big electronic billboard outside of Fremantle Oval and it had APO on it. And there was a running joke that I used to drop to the Libs and to the ALP. I used to say, I don't know where the APO begins and the political parties end, because the influence of them is so great. And they do actually capture our MPs, and you see it on a daily basis. They walk in through the front door and they get what they want. And I was there when the EPA was being skewered for recommending the regulations around the limits of emissions. But what we're working on now is we're working on, in my current role, is in the northwest, we're looking at the expansion of the gas industry. We have a fracking industry that's not dead. The state government has allowed still 2% of the state, which looks like it still can be fracked. And from what I understand, Woodside are slithering around the northwest to ensure that they can meet some of the shortfalls by using some of the frack gas. So the industrialisation of the Kimberley is still very much on the agenda, and we still need to stop it. But going to COP28, I have faith, but it's going to be off the back of a lot of the work of activists calling governments out on all different levels. Because if we don't have people, yes, we've got people recommending policy, but if we don't have people out there putting themselves in the front lines, people aren't going to notice what's going on. And we do need to make sure that we support them. Because at the last COP, COP27, there were 637 organisations that were representing the oil and gas industry there. And yet, I know a lot of people, academics, that had to fund themselves to get to COP27 as well as COP28. So they do need the support. So we're coming into a hot summer. Reach out to everyone you know that's involved in any form of climate action and make sure you support them, because we're also looking at more oppressive laws than what we've ever seen. And I know from the recent actions, and we have to support the activists that we saw in Four Corners, that the government was considering mirroring the South Australian legislation to up the fines and put people in prison. So we can't have draconian laws in our state either. So I'll finish off there, but I'm looking forward to Q&A, but thank you so much.
This is Bill Hare.
Okay, thanks. Look, I guess my final comment is to really truly feel and know that our backs are against the wall of climate change. We are running out of time. That these impacts that you read about in the news are going to come here, and they're going to come faster than anyone wants. And the action to take is really to get onto the political class here, federally and state-wise, and get them to change. And I think anyone who's observed the political system here in the last years probably is right to think that the only way to do that is to move the major parties into a minority government situation. So really think about that.
One thing I learned from people in the Middle East is that there's a lot of self-sacrifice that they do for the greater good, for their country, for their community, for freedom, whatever. I don't see that here in the West. I think we've got a lot to learn from them. I want everyone here tonight to think, what can they do? Sacrifice their time, their money to help on this issue. Find your climate community. It doesn't have to be Greenpeace. It could be Disrupt Borough Pub. It could be the Wilderness Society. It could be CCWA, whatever. Find somewhere where you can meet friends, find allies, and donate a couple of days a month to this critical human rights crisis that is going to impact the people and the places that we love in our lifetimes.
I think it's hopeful to see that the Trumpian narrative in America is now collapsing, that the Proud Boys are going to jail, and that notion that many of the leaders in America were in fact lizards that were living off babies And people believed this. They believed it. It was part of the story. It is. It's funny, but this is what was happening, and it would spread around, and people like Hillary Clinton were seeing actually lizards. That was the sort of stupidity that was happening in America. It's collapsing because it's nonsense, and it's been shown to be nonsense and illegal, and in fact killing their society. So it is. But it took a while. You've got to work through the systems. You've got to make it very obvious that the Inflation Reduction Act is a better way to look to the future than electing stupid people who believe such things. So we have to display that same kind of ability to bring our Trumpian gas narrative down.
Yeah, I'd like to finish by just thinking about a lot of people that can't be in this room, and that's a lot of people that are getting crushed by the inequality crisis, because I see the climate crisis being equal to the social justice as what we see out there in the community today. I've done a lot of door knocking. I've seen people who are renting. I've seen single parents, I've spoken to them, who can't afford to pay their energy bills. And it's a real luxury to actually think about a battery to put on your home, or even a solar panel. There are a lot of renters out there that can't afford that stuff. They don't have a voice. And what we're seeing a great divide within our community between the people that can think about actually buying an electric car and people that can only dream of it, or people who don't even know that it exists. So I think the people that have the privilege in this room need to be very loud about it, because they have a privilege and they have a voice that can be loud about it too. So when you see a policy that is put forward to the government, like we've seen with the solar panel rebate, think about all the people out in West Armidale, Gosnells, Kelmscott, all of these places across the country that live in low socioeconomic areas that literally do not have a voice like we have to actually speak up and speak to a politician. In fact, they probably don't even know who their local member is. So that we have to always look at any of these solutions in a social justice lens, because if we don't, we're going to have the crazy conspiracies go rife. So we have to reach out to people in the community to make sure that they're not isolated, and to make sure that we actually stand with them in this transition, as well as hardcore as we would stand up to any oil and gas company or anybody who are attending Dubai and paying $1,000 to go on a plane to attend that. So let's just make sure that we keep that in perspective, because it's a very important element of this thing.
My second thought is that all speakers are equal, but some, as George Orwell said, are more equal than others. And that is Sophie McNeill, who came in at the last minute. And she is not getting away tonight until she autographs my copy. When we started this about 4 years ago, taking over from the wonderful work that Brad and Rachel Pemberton and Brian and who was the other Canadian dude? And we thought, I always thought politics would be perfect with about 20 sitting around having a jolly good argument, everyone back and forth. Well, big is quite beautiful as well. I hope you haven't been a bit too frustrated if you couldn't get a question in, because it is such a big audience. But thank you very much for supporting us. These are just the people I know that are real experts in their field. We've got Climate Clever here, famous on TV, and we've got Fraser Maywood from Sustainable Energy Now, and we've got Mark Brogan over here, who's penned a fantastic letter about the right to protest, and they're just some of the ones I know. There's some brilliant people here. Please, the joy of politics in the pub is you arrive early and stay late. They will start trying to pressure you by stacking the chairs at about 9:30, but if you want to, please stay, have a drink, chat to people, and maybe you can press the question directly to them that you're burning to answer. Finally, the next is the last, the 28th of November, if my calculations are right. So please write down what you think would be a good topic to finish the year for us. And thank you very much for your time. Have a good chat to people in them as long as you want.
There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of good things have come out from tonight, but I think we haven't heard enough from the future generations that are going to bear the brunt of the shitty future that they've inherited through no fault of their own. And one of my dear friends, if they still want to come up and say something, because I think it's very important that we hear from these people.
I just wanted to ask a question. We were talking about COP. This whole thing is about COP. And the first COP happened when I was born in 1995. And in my lifetime, I have not seen any tangible governments beholden to the commitments that came from COP, like the Paris Agreement. So what is COP28 going to achieve for my generation? Because I every single day have to wake up with this grief and this horrible sense of this overcoming sense of I don't know what to do. Many people